Welcome to the deep dive. So, I want you to picture something.
Okay.
Imagine it is just this brutal, freezing winter in 1917, and we are in the capital of the Russian Empire, Petrograd.
Right. A city that's just, well, it's literally sliced in half by the River Neva, which is completely frozen over at this point.
Exactly. And on the right bank of that river, you have the workers' quarters. I mean, it is gritty, it is industrial, and the people there are literally starving.
You've got these smokestacks just choked with ice.
Right, and tens of thousands of people shivering in the dark, desperate for just like a single loaf of bread. But then, if you stand on that right bank and look across the ice to the left bank,
It's like looking at a totally different planet.
it really is. You see these fashionable districts.
Yeah.
The Winter Palace is there, incredibly warm, brilliantly lit.
We got the aristocrats, the Duma politicians, all the men in power.
Yeah. And the only thing connecting these two completely alien worlds is this sheet of ice. And that ice, as we're going to see, is about to crack wide open.
Which ends up swallowing an empire that had stood for centuries. I mean, that geographic divide in Petrograd is just, it's the perfect physical manifestation of a society that has been pushed past the absolute limit of human endurance.
It really is.
We're looking at this moment where centuries of this rigid, basically medieval autocracy finally collide with the 20th century, the mechanized, crushing realities of it.
And it doesn't just topple a czar, right? It unleashes the shockwave that rewrites the genetic code of global politics for the next 100 years.
Absolutely.
So that is the journey we are taking today. We are unpacking the Russian Revolution and the explosive rise of socialism in Europe. We're going to explore how ideas that were, just politely debated in post-revolutionary French drawing rooms.
How those ideas mutated into literal steel and fire in the streets of Russia.
Exactly. Now, really quickly, before we jump in, as we unpack this history, we are stepping into some highly charged territory. We're dealing with autocracy, capitalism, socialism, communism, ideologies that still spark massive controversy today.
Oh, definitely. People have very strong feelings about this stuff.
Right. So, to be totally transparent, we are not here to take sides. We aren't endorsing any of these political systems. Our goal is strictly to just unpack the historical events and concepts exactly as they're presented in our source material.
Right, we're just dissecting the history to understand what drove the people who actually lived through this meat grinder.
Yeah, to figure out how these ideas literally reshaped the globe. So, let's dive in.
Okay, so to understand how we get to that frozen river in 1917, we actually can't start in Russia.
Right, we have to rewind.
Yeah, we have to look at the massive psychological vacuum that was created across Europe right after the French Revolution. Because, I mean, before 1789, European society was basically a caste system.
You had states and orders, right?
Exactly. The aristocracy and the church held absolutely all the cards. Economic, social, political power, you name it. And it was static. You were born into your station and you died in it.
And that was all under the premise of the divine right of kings.
Yes. The idea that the king is placed there by God.
So to question the king is to question the fabric of the universe itself.
Exactly. But then the French Revolution happens, and it takes that entire philosophical architecture and just shatters it.
Right, because suddenly you have these incredibly infectious ideas circulating. Ideas about individual freedom, equality, citizenship.
And, the physical act of actually beheading a monarch, it proved that the old system was not divinely ordained. It was just a system, and systems can be unmade.
Which creates this profound panic among the elites, obviously, but also this massive opportunity.
Right, the vacuum was there. So the burning question for literally every intellectual, peasant, and aristocrat in Europe became, okay, how do we rebuild society now that the old rules are completely dead?
And what's wild is that those debates didn't just stay in places like Paris or London. The source text notes that these shockwaves reached all the way to colonial India.
Oh, yeah.
You had figures in India like Raja Rammohan Roy and Desrosiers who were passionately debating these exact European post-revolutionary ideas.
It was a global realization that the architecture of power was suddenly malleable.
But of course, just because the architecture was malleable didn't mean everyone actually wanted to tear down the building.
Not at all.
Yeah.
As Europe moves into the 19th century, the political spectrum basically fractures into three distinct camps, trying to answer that big question of how to rebuild. You've got the conservatives, the liberals, and the radicals.
Okay, let's unpack this because we really need to peel back the modern baggage of those terms. They meant something very specific back then.
Right.
Let's start with the group that was terrified of the chaos, the conservatives.
Well, initially, right after the French Revolution, The conservatives basically wanted to just pretend the whole thing never happened.
Just put the king back on the throne, give the church its land back, and pretend it's still 1788.
Exactly. They viewed the revolution as this horrific aberration. But as the 19th century rolls on, the smarter conservatives realize, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. They accept that some societal evolution is inevitable. But their core psychological driver was still this deep reverence for the past. They believed institutions like the monarchy and the church provided essential stability.
So any change, in their view, had to be agonizingly slow.
Agonizingly slow, deeply respectful of tradition, and managed from the top down, all to prevent the quote-unquote mob from tearing society apart.
I mean, they're looking at the Reign of Terror in France, the guillotine, and saying, look, this is what happens when you move too fast. We have to pump the brakes and maintain order.
Right, so that's the conservatives. Then you have the liberals.
Okay, and this is where the definitions get tricky.
Yeah, because a 19th century liberal might sound progressive on paper today, but their underlying motivations were highly specific. They wanted nations that tolerated all religions.
Which, to be fair, was a radical idea at a time when states formally discriminated, like Britain favoring the Church of England or Spain favoring Catholicism.
Exactly. And they also wanted to strip dynastic rulers of their absolute unchecked power. They argued fiercely for independent judiciaries and elected parliamentary governments.
Right, to protect the rights of the individual against the state. Which sounds incredibly familiar to us. I mean, it sounds like the blueprint for a modern Western democracy.
It does. But there's a massive catch.
And what is the catch?
The catch is their definition of the individual. They were absolutely not Democrats in the modern sense. They did not believe in universal adult franchise.
Ah.
They believed that the right to vote should be strictly limited to men of property. Wealthy factory owners, merchants, landowners.
So they actively excluded the working poor, and obviously they entirely excluded women.
Completely. It's a fascinating psychological profile. They're fighting the aristocrats above them to gain political power, but they're equally terrified of the uneducated, impoverished masses below them.
I like to think of it like a modern failing company. The liberals want a society run by a board of directors, not a true democracy. They want liberty, but they define liberty as the freedom to conduct business and own property without the king interfering.
Right. Which brings us to the radicals.
And the radicals look at the liberals and just see hypocrisy.
Exactly. Radicals argued for a government based on the actual majority of a country's population. They were the ones pushing for universal suffrage, and they supported the powerful suffragette movements for women.
And they actively opposed those entrenched privileges of the great landowners and the wealthy factory owners.
Yeah, now to be clear, they weren't universally opposed to private property as a concept, but they were deeply opposed to the concentration of that property in the hands of a tiny elite.
Okay, so going back to our company analogy, the conservatives want to keep the old CEO. The liberals want to elect a new board of directors but keep the corporate structure. And the radicals want the actual shareholders to vote on everything.
That's a great way to look at it. But bubbling underneath all of this is a fourth ideology, one that looks at the entire economic machine of the 19th century, the factories, the slums, the extreme poverty, and decides that the problem isn't who is running the machine.
The problem is the machine itself.
Exactly. And that ideology is socialism. By the mid-19th century, this wasn't just a fringe theory anymore. It was a highly organized body of thought capturing the imagination of millions of people.
And the absolute bedrock of the socialist argument, according to our text, the thing they identified as the root of all societal suffering, was private property.
Yes, the private ownership of the means of production.
Right, and let's dig into the mechanics of that, because when we say private property here, we aren't talking about someone's personal toothbrush, right? Or clothes on their back.
No. We're talking about the factories, the coal mines, massive tracts of agricultural land. The socialist critique was that the person who owns the factory, the capitalist, only cares about one metric: personal profit.
Which is the core mechanism of their critique. I mean, the factory owner provides the capital, sure, but it's the worker who provides the physical labor that actually generates the value.
Right. The worker's the one losing limbs in the looms, breathing in coal dust, working these grueling 15-hour shifts.
But because the owner holds the deed to the property, the owner extracts all the surplus value, the profit, while paying the worker the absolute bare minimum required to keep them alive and coming back to work.
The socialists argued this wasn't just unfair, it was structurally exploitative. It's an inherently adversarial relationship.
Because the owner's profit relies on keeping wages low, and the worker's survival relies on pushing wages high.
Exactly. So the socialists look at this and say, look, as long as one individual owns the property, the welfare of the collective will always be sacrificed for personal gain.
So their solution was a total paradigm shift. Society as a whole must control the property. If the community owns the factory can be run to produce what the community needs rather than what makes the most profit for one guy at the top.
What's fascinating here is that this didn't just stay theoretical. They were building a massive transnational infrastructure around this idea.
Right. By the 1870s, you see the formation of this international body called the Second International.
Yeah, it was an organization designed to coordinate socialist efforts across different countries. Workers in England and Germany are forming these vast associations. They aren't just reading theory, they're taking action.
Setting up mutual aid funds to help members during strikes or if they get sick, demanding reduced working hours, fighting for the right to vote.
They are building an entirely parallel civil society.
Yeah.
I mean, in Germany, these workers' associations are integrating with the Social Democratic Party and actually winning seats in parliament.
And by the early 1900s, you have the Labour Party forming in Britain, the Socialist Party in France, and they're creating an incredibly potent brand.
Oh, the branding was genius. They adopt the red flag, tracing it back to the Paris Communards. They sing the Marseillaise.
They're forging a shared identity that transcends national borders. They're telling a German coal miner and a French textile worker, hey, you two have more in common with each other than you do with the wealthy factory owners in your own countries.
It is a profound shift in allegiance, moving away from nationalism and toward class solidarity. But we have to look at the reality on the ground in Western Europe, up until 1914.
Right. Despite all this massive organization, the trade unions, the parliamentary seats, they never actually managed to form a government in these industrialized nations.
No, they acted as a powerful opposition. They forced legislation, they definitely improved working conditions, but the levers of state power remained firmly in the hands of conservatives, liberals, and radicals.
Which really leads us to the grand irony of this entire historical narrative. Karl Marx and the early socialists looked at industrialized powerhouses like Britain or Germany and thought, okay, this is where the revolution will happen.
Yeah, they believed you absolutely needed a massive industrialized working class to overthrow the capitalist system.
But the revolution didn't happen in London. It didn't happen in Berlin. It happened in the most backward, least industrialized, most aggressively autocratic empire in Europe.
Tsarist Russia, the Russian exception. It completely defies the orthodox Marxist timeline.
So to understand how this ideological cauldron of Europe spilled over and ignited in Russia, we have to examine the sheer scale and the archaic structure of the Russian Empire in 1914. Let's map out that empire.
Okay, well, we're talking about a landmass that almost defies comprehension. Tsar Nicholas II rules a territory stretching from the borders of Germany and the Baltic Sea, all the way across the Eurasian landmass to the Pacific Ocean.
I mean, it swallows up modern-day Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, Ukraine, massive chunks of Central Asia, running all the way down to the borders of the Ottoman Empire.
And within that staggering geography, you have this kaleidoscope of humanity. The dominant group is the Russian Orthodox Christians, of course.
But you also have tens of millions of Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, and Buddhists.
Exactly. But the demographic statistic that truly defines the empire, the one we really need to focus on, is this. Roughly 85% of the population earned their living from agriculture.
Wow. 85%. I mean, if you compare that to France or Germany at the time, they were hovering around 40 or 50%.
Right. Russia is just an ocean of peasants.
An ocean of peasants ruled by an absolute monarch.
Because a czar is not a constitutional monarch. There's no parliament. There's no legal political opposition whatsoever. The czar's word is literal, unchallenged law, backed by a massive military and a ruthless secret police force.
But, okay, there were tiny islands of industry in this peasant ocean, right? Places like St. Petersburg and Moscow.
Yes, there were. In the 1890s, the Russian state pushed for this rapid, forced industrialization. They expanded the railway network. They invited in massive amounts of foreign capital.
So suddenly you have these foreign-owned mega factories springing up right next to traditional craft workshops. Coal production doubles, iron and steel output quadruples.
But because this industrialization is so rapid and so late to the game, the social conditions are catastrophic.
The human cost is just appalling. You have peasants pouring into the cities looking for wage labor, and they are shoved into these squalid barracks.
Sometimes they're even sleeping in shifts. Like, one guy gets the bed for 8 hours, goes to the factory, and the next guy takes the warm bed.
15-hour workdays in the workshops, 12 hours in the heavy factories, no safety regulations. It's basically the worst excesses of the Industrial Revolution, but compressed into a couple of decades.
So you have a small, highly concentrated, deeply exploited industrial working class, the proletariat. But the vast, vast majority of the empire remains rural. And this brings us to a crucial sociological mechanism that makes Russia totally unique.
The nature of the Russian peasant.
Right. Historians often call this the peasant paradox.
Because if you look at Western Europe, say France, during the Revolution, the peasants often had a deep, almost religious reverence for their local nobility. The noble was seen as the paternal figure of the region.
Right. But in Russia, that bond simply didn't exist. The Russian nobility generally didn't derive their power from local popularity or deep ancestral ties to the specific land they managed.
They derived their power entirely from their service to the Tsar. They were essentially just bureaucrats with titles.
Exactly. As a result, the peasants had zero respect for them. The peasants believed, with absolute conviction, that the land belonged to the people who actually worked it.
And there is a long, bloody history in Russia of peasants simply refusing to pay rent, rising up, and outright murdering their landlords.
Oh, yeah. But it goes deeper than just hating the boss. The peasants had a highly sophisticated, deeply ingrained system of communal living. They didn't operate on Western concepts of individual private property.
They lived in communes, right, called the Mir.
The Mir. It is the defining institution of rural Russian life. The commune owned the land collectively. Periodically, the elders of the Mir would take all the agricultural land and actually redistribute it among the families based on their changing needs.
So, if a family had 3 strong sons come of age, they got more land. If an elder died, their land was reabsorbed and given to someone who needed it.
Exactly.
And I really want to dig into the psychology of this for a second, because some radical thinkers at the time looked at the Mir and said, look, the Russian peasants are natural-born socialists. They already share the land. They already reject private property.
We don't need to wait for capitalism to industrialize the whole country. We can base a socialist revolution right now on the peasant commune.
Right. But let's think about human nature and the actual environment here. This is Russia. The growing season is incredibly short. The winters are lethal.
Yeah, if you try to operate as a rugged individualist out on the steppe and your plow breaks or your horse dies,
Yeah.
you don't just go bankrupt. You freeze to death. Your family starves.
Exactly. So the Mir isn't necessarily a utopian Marxist ideological choice. It is a brutal, pragmatic survival mechanism. You pool your risk or you die. So the question is, does sharing land out of sheer desperation actually make you a Marxist revolutionary?
That specific question tore the Russian revolutionary underground apart. It created the fundamental fracture in how to bring down the Tsar.
Because on one side, you had the Socialist Revolutionary Party, formed around 1900.
Right. They looked at the numbers, 85% of the country, and they looked at the Mir. And they argued that the peasantry was the natural revolutionary class of Russia.
So their strategy was basically agrarian terror and rural uprising. They wanted to seize the massive estates of the nobility and hand them over to the peasant communes.
But then on the other side, you had the Social Democrats. And these were the strict orthodox followers of Karl Marx.
And they looked at the peasants and said, no, Marx was clear. The peasantry is a dying reactionary class.
They pointed out that the Mir was actually breaking down. Some peasants were becoming wealthy and employing other peasants. Some were deeply religious and conservative.
Right, so the Social Democrats argued that a fragmented rural population could never lead a modern revolution. The vanguard of the revolution had to be the industrial working class in the cities.
The proletariat, even though there were vastly fewer of them.
Because they were concentrated, subjected to the absolute extremes of capitalist exploitation, and they were learning how to organize.
Exactly. But even within that group, the Social Democrats who agreed that the factory workers were the key, they couldn't agree on how to physically build the political party to do it.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because this is where the most consequential figure of the 20th century walks onto the stage, Vladimir Lenin.
Yes. Lenin was a brilliant but ruthless political strategist. He looked at the reality of the Tsarist police state. The secret police, the Okhrana, were everywhere. They infiltrated every union, every student group.
So Lenin argued that if you build a mass, open political party like the Social Democrats had in Germany, the Tsar's police will just crush it in a week.
Exactly. So Lenin's faction, which became known as the Bolsheviks, believed the party had to be an elite, tightly controlled, highly disciplined vanguard of professional revolutionaries.
You don't just let anyone join.
No, you vet them. You demand total obedience to the Central Committee.
I mean, it operates more like a military intelligence network than a political party.
Precisely. Now, the opposing faction, the Mensheviks, recoiled at that. They wanted a broader, more democratic, more inclusive party, open to anyone who supported the cause. They feared Lenin's model would lead to a dictatorship of the party over the workers.
Okay, so the pressure is building from literally every direction. You have a massive, archaic autocracy. You have tens of millions of peasants who want the land. You have exploding, hyper-exploitative industrial cities. And you have these brilliant, ruthless underground operatives arguing over the best way to light the fuse.
The underground operations were incredible.
Right. We actually have historical accounts that paint a visceral picture of what this underground war looked like. The text mentions Alexander Shlepnikov, a socialist metal worker.
Oh, his accounts are fascinating. He describes how they ran these illegal underground operations right under the noses of the authorities.
Yeah, he wrote about how propaganda was whispered man to man on the factory floor. They would use legal meetings, like a state-sanctioned insurance board, and subvert them to plan strikes.
The most amazing part is how they ran their rallies. They would organize basically a flash mob inside the factory.
Right. Suddenly, a worker jumps on a lathe, delivers this blistering 5-minute revolutionary speech. They take a quick vote on a strike, and the moment the factory manager picks up the telephone to call the police, the crowd just vanishes.
By the time the armed guards arrive, everyone is just quietly machining parts again.
It's a profound level of tactical discipline. The workers are learning how to operate collectively, how to defy authority, and how to survive in a police state.
The powder is dry. All it needs is a spark.
And that spark arrives in 1905.
Right. To understand 1905, you have to understand the economic baseline. For the Russian worker, 1904 was a disastrous year.
Inflation was completely out of control.
Yeah. The prices of essential goods skyrocketed so fast that real wages effectively dropped by 20% in a single year. People are working 15 hours a day, and they literally cannot afford bread.
And the breaking point comes in St. Petersburg at the massive Putilov Ironworks.
4 workers who belong to a state-approved workers' assembly are fired. In response, the workers call for a massive industrial strike, and the solidarity is just staggering. Within days, over 110,000 workers across the capital throw down their tools.
And their demands are actually incredibly modern. They want an 8-hour workday, living wages, and safer conditions.
And this leads to a march. But it's vital to understand the psychology of this march. It wasn't a violent Marxist uprising. It was led by a priest, Father Gapon.
The workers were dressed in their Sunday best. They were carrying icons of saints and portraits of the Tsar. They were singing hymns.
They genuinely believed in the myth of the little father. The cultural belief was that the Tsar was good and loved his people, and that all the suffering was caused by his corrupt, evil ministers keeping the truth from him.
They believed that if they just walked to the Winter Palace and handed a petition directly to the Tsar, he would fix it.
It is a tragic, almost medieval mindset colliding with state violence. As this massive, peaceful procession approaches the Winter Palace, they are met not by the Tsar, but by the police and the Cossacks.
The Tsar's elite feared cavalry.
Right. The order is given to clear the streets. The troops open fire directly into the unarmed crowd. Over 100 workers are killed. Hundreds more are wounded. Blood stains the snow of the capital. This event becomes known as Bloody Sunday.
And the mechanism of what broke that day is crucial. When those bullets hit the crowd, they didn't just kill the marchers, they killed the myth of the little father.
The psychological bond between the autocrat and the masses was completely, irrevocably severed.
From that moment on, the Tsar wasn't an ailing father figure, he was an enemy combatant.
And the reaction was instantaneous and massive. Bloody Sunday triggered a nationwide shockwave that became the 1905 revolution.
The entire country essentially went on strike. Universities shut down. The middle-class lawyers, doctors, engineers formed the Union of Unions, demanding a democratic constituent assembly.
The railways stopped running. The economy ground to a complete halt.
The pressure is so immense that the Tsar's advisors tell him he has to bend or the monarchy will snap.
So he is forced to issue the October Manifesto. This granted civil liberties and, crucially, allowed the creation of an elected parliament, known as the Duma.
For a brief, shining moment, it looks like Russia might transition into a constitutional monarchy. Trade unions operate openly, factory committees assert themselves.
But Nicholas II despises this. He believes God gave him absolute power, and giving it away is literally a sin. So the moment the immediate threat of violence subsides, he starts walking it all back.
He treats the Duma not as a governing body, but as an advisory council he can just ignore.
Exactly. The first Duma is far too radical for him. It demands land reform, so he dissolves it within 75 days. The second Duma is also too stubborn. Dissolved.
So he unilaterally changes the electoral laws. He rigs the system so heavily in favor of the wealthy landowners that the Third Duma is packed with pliant conservative politicians.
He forces the revolutionary leaders back underground. He outlaws the unions again.
He builds a pressure cooker, locks the lid down tighter than ever, and assumes the fire's gone out. But the fire is just burning deeper, and the event that finally causes the entire contraption to detonate isn't a domestic strike, it is a geopolitical catastrophe.
World War I. If we connect this to the bigger picture, in 1914, the intricate web of European alliances activates. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire face off against France, Britain, and Russia.
Now, initially, the war actually works in the Tsar's favor, right?
Yeah, there is a massive wave of patriotic, anti-German fervor. People rally around the flag. They even rename the capital from the Germanic-sounding St. Petersburg to the Slavic Petrograd.
But modern mechanized warfare is a brutal auditor of a nation's infrastructure. And the Russian infrastructure was just a house of cards.
A total house of cards. Look at the logistics. You have millions of peasants conscripted into the army. But the Russian industrial base simply cannot produce enough rifles, enough artillery shells, or even enough boots to equip them.
There are literal stories of Russian soldiers being sent into the trenches completely unarmed, told to just wait for the guy next to them to die so they can pick up his rifle.
The human toll is beyond comprehension. Between 1914 and 1916, the Russian army is ground into dust by the Germans and Austrians. We're talking about over 7 million casualties.
7 million dead, wounded, or captured in 2 years.
And the horror wasn't just on the front lines. As the Russian army retreated across its own territory, it employed a scorched earth policy. They burned their own crops, destroyed their own infrastructure to leave nothing for the advancing Germans.
Which displaced over 3 million Russian civilians, turning them into starving refugees flooding back into the interior.
The psychological impact on the army is total demoralization. These are peasant conscripts. They are dying by the millions for a czar who they already despise in a war they don't understand while their families are starving back home.
And back home, the economy is totally disintegrating. Russia was cut off from European imports by the German naval blockade of the Baltic Sea. The few factories they had couldn't maintain their machinery.
The railway system, the actual arteries of the empire, began to literally break down. Locomotives broke and couldn't be repaired.
And this is the critical logistical failure. Because the trains are breaking down and because the military is seizing whatever trains are working to move troops, food cannot get to the cities.
Right. There might be grain in the countryside, but it is rotting at the train stations. Meanwhile, millions of able-bodied men have been pulled out of the workforce to die in the trenches. Small workshops shut down. To feed the army, the government requisitions massive amounts of grain.
So if you are a worker in Petrograd in the winter of 1916, you are working longer hours than ever to produce war materials. Your wages are worthless because of hyperinflation, and there's physically no bread in the bakeries.
You spend all day in a freezing factory, and then you stand in line for 6 hours in the snow, only to be told the flour didn't arrive. Riots at the bread shops become a daily occurrence.
Which brings us right back to that frozen river in February of 1917, the start of the tale of two revolutions.
But before we cross that ice, we should probably do a quick historical housekeeping note. The events we are about to discuss are universally known as the February Revolution and the October Revolution.
Right. But if you look at a modern calendar, they happen in March and November. Why the discrepancy?
It's just a quirk of the calendar. Up until 1918, Russia was still using the archaic Julian calendar, while the rest of Europe used the modern Gregorian calendar. The Russian calendar was 13 days behind.
Got it. So the events that the Russians recorded in late February actually happened in early March to the rest of the world. We'll use the traditional Russian naming conventions, February and October, because that is how history remembers them.
Okay, so late February 1917, the temperature in Petrograd drops to an agonizing 35 degrees below zero. The factories on the right bank are freezing. On February 22nd, a major factory locks out its workers over a wage dispute.
And the very next day, February 23rd, is International Women's Day. And this is a detail from the text that often gets glossed over. It is the women who shatter the empire.
Absolutely. The women textile workers had reached their absolute breaking point. They leave their factories. They march to the metalworks and the munitions plants, shaming the men, demanding they drop their tools and join them.
They are not marching for abstract political theory. They are marching because their children are starving. They are demanding bread.
Within hours, 50 factories are on strike. The crowd swells to hundreds of thousands. They cross the frozen river. They cross the bridges. They flood into the Nevsky Prospect, the fashionable heart of the capital.
And the Tsar's government reacts the only way it knows how: force. They deploy the police and the cavalry. They disperse the crowds, but the next day, the crowds come right back. And they come back the day after that.
And notice the slogans shift. They go from bread to down with the war and down with the autocracy.
The pivotal moment arrives on Sunday, February 26th. The Tsar, who is away at military headquarters, sends a telegram ordering the military commander of Petrograd to suppress the disorder by tomorrow using lethal force.
The troops are deployed, they fire into the crowds, dozens are killed. But then, the fundamental mechanism of state power fails.
The soldiers look at the crowds. They look at the women begging for bread. And these soldiers aren't elite, wealthy guardsmen. They are peasant conscripts in uniform.
Right. They realize they have more in common with the starving workers than with the officers ordering them to shoot.
Overnight, mutiny spreads like a virus through the barracks. The Povolsky regiment shoots its own commanding officer. Entire regiments vote to join the revolution. They hand their weapons to the workers.
And the moment a state's military refuses to obey orders, the state ceases to exist. Power simply evaporated. The generals look at the situation, they look at the collapsing war front, and they realize the Tsar is a massive liability.
A delegation of military commanders and Duma politicians intercepts the Tsar's train. They advise him that the only way to save Russia and the war effort is to abdicate.
On March 2nd, Nicholas II signs the paper. In an instant, the Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia as absolute autocrats for 300 years, is gone. It just vanishes.
But tearing down a system is entirely different from building a new one. The abdication creates an immediate, massive power vacuum, and what fills it is a highly unstable, deeply weird political arrangement known as dual power.
Dual power. We need to break down the mechanics of this because it explains everything that happens next. It's essentially two parallel governments trying to run the same country at the same time.
Okay, let's look at the two sides. On one side, you have the provisional government.
Right. When the Tsar fell, the moderate politicians in the Duma, the liberals and the moderate socialists, stepped up and formed a temporary cabinet. They sit in the official government offices, they wear suits, they issue decrees.
They are officially recognized by foreign allies like Britain and France. They plan to eventually hold elections for a real democratic parliament.
That is the official power. But then you have the actual power on the streets. As the revolution was happening, the factory workers and the mutinous soldiers organically resurrected an idea from 1905, the Soviet.
Right, a Soviet is simply a council. Every factory elected delegates, every military regiment elected delegates. They all met in a massive, chaotic assembly called the Petrograd Soviet.
To put this in modern terms.
I like to imagine it like a high school.
Okay.
The provisional government is the principal sitting in the office. They have the title, they have the official letterhead, and they make announcements over the PA system saying classes will continue as normal.
Right.
But the Petrograd Soviet is the student council, except the student council has walkie-talkies, they control the cafeteria workers, and they have all the security guards on their side.
That's perfect. The principal can issue an order, but if the student council tells the security guards to ignore it, the order is meaningless.
That is exactly the dynamic. The provisional government had official authority, but zero physical force. The Soviet had no official authority, but they controlled the telegraphs, the railways, and the troops.
The Soviet even issued the famous Order Number 1, which instructed soldiers to only obey the provisional government if the Soviet agreed with the order. It completely neutered the official government.
So a huge question here is, why didn't the Soviet just take over immediately if they had all the actual power?
Because of Marxist ideology. The leaders of the Soviet at this time were Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. They believed in the orthodox Marxist timeline.
Oh, right.
Marxist theory stated that societies must evolve through specific stages. Feudalism evolves into capitalism. Capitalism develops industry and a massive working class. And only then can the working class overthrow capitalism to create socialism.
So because Russia had just overthrown feudalism, the Tsar, according to Orthodox Marxists, Russia had to enter its capitalist democratic phase.
Exactly. They believed it was historically incorrect for socialists to take power now. They felt they had to support the bourgeois provisional government and let capitalism develop.
They are slaves to the theoretical timeline. They have the literal power in their hands, but they give it back because the theory says it isn't time yet.
But then, in April 1917, a train pulls into the Finland station in Petrograd. And stepping off that train is a man who is about to blow up the entire Marxist timeline.
Vladimir Lenin has returned from exile in Switzerland.
Lenin assesses the situation of dual power and delivers what becomes known as the April Theses. It drops like a theoretical bomb on the socialist movement.
What did he argue?
He argues that the orthodox Marxists are completely wrong. He says, why wait? Why allow the bourgeoisie to consolidate power? He declares that Russia can skip the capitalist democratic phase entirely. The revolution can transition immediately from the bourgeois phase to the socialist phase.
It is an audacious, massive ideological gamble. He is essentially saying, we don't need to build the automobile. We are going to strap rockets to the horse-drawn carriage and go straight to the moon.
He reduces complex Marxist theory into three incredibly brilliant, brutally effective political demands. The April Theses: peace, land, and bread.
Okay, so 1, end the war immediately. 2, transfer all the land to the peasants immediately. And 3, nationalize the banks and transfer all state power to the Soviets. All power to the Soviets.
Even his own Bolshevik party thinks he has lost his mind at first. They think he has been away too long. But Lenin understands the psychology of the masses better than anyone.
Because the provisional government was making catastrophic errors. They refused to pull out of World War I because they needed British and French loans, and they refused to redistribute the land, saying they had to wait for official elections.
So the peasants just start doing it themselves. Throughout the summer of 1917, the countryside descends into total anarchy. Peasant communes form land committees, walk over to the noble estates, burn down the manor houses, and simply take the land.
And the Russian army, which is mostly peasants, hears about this. Soldiers desert by the hundreds of thousands, taking their rifles and walking home to get their share of the land.
Meanwhile, in the cities, the economy is still collapsing. Factory owners try to lock out workers. Workers respond by seizing control of the factories themselves. The provisional government, growing desperate, tries to crack down. They arrest Bolshevik leaders. They suppress worker demonstrations.
But they have lost the narrative. By autumn, the Bolsheviks have gained the majority in the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. The people don't want parliamentary debates anymore. They want food, and they want the war to end.
Lenin realizes the window is closing. If they wait for the official elections, the provisional government might establish a military dictatorship to restore order. It is time to strike.
Which brings us to the October Revolution. Now, we often picture revolutions as massive, chaotic street riots like the storming of the Bastille. But the October Revolution was not a riot.
No, it was an infrastructural coup, masterminded by Leon Trotsky.
Let's look at the mechanics of this takeover. Trotsky is the brilliant organizational mind behind it. He forms the Military Revolutionary Committee within the Petrograd Soviet.
Right, he systematically secures the loyalty of the key military garrisons in the city. And he didn't send mobs to attack the Winter Palace initially. He looked at the modern city as a machine, and he simply unplugged the government from the machine.
On the night of October 24th, squads of armed Bolshevik workers, the Red Guards, and sympathetic sailors slip out into the freezing darkness. They don't make speeches.
They go to the telephone exchange, and they unplug the provisional government's phones. They go to the telegraph office. They take the railway stations so no loyalist troops can arrive. They seize the bridges over the Neva River. They take the power plants.
By the time the sun rises on October 25th, the citizens of Petrograd wake up to find that the city functions exactly as it did yesterday, except the provisional government is completely trapped and isolated in the Winter Palace.
They have no phones, no transport, and no power. The prime minister literally has to borrow a car from the American embassy to flee the city and try to find loyal troops.
That evening, the cruiser Aurora, manned by revolutionary sailors, fires a blank shell down the river. It's the signal. The Red Guards infiltrate the Winter Palace.
It isn't a massive battle. It's mostly teenagers and a women's battalion guarding the ministers. The ministers surrender.
In a span of 24 hours, with almost no bloodshed in the capital, the Bolsheviks seize control of the Russian state. Lenin stands up at the Congress of Soviets and effectively announces, "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order."
But as the old saying goes, it is easy to seize power. It is terrifyingly difficult to hold it. And the Bolsheviks have just seized power in a country that is economically ruined, socially fractured, and still actively losing a massive world war.
This transition pulls us into the darkest phase of our deep dive, from utopia to dystopia. Taking power is one thing, but forcing an entire society to conform to a new ideology that leads to unimaginable human suffering.
The Bolsheviks start issuing decrees immediately, trying to mandate their ideology into physical reality. Within weeks, they abolish private property.
They nationalize the banks. The state simply takes ownership of the vaults.
They validate the peasant land seizures, effectively abolishing the massive estates. They ban aristocratic titles. Everyone is to be addressed as citizen or comrade.
They even try to mandate a cultural reset through fashion, which is wild. The text mentions they hold a competition to design new military uniforms.
The Bajanovka, right?
Yeah, a pointed cloth hat meant to evoke ancient Russian bogatirs, but branded with a red star. They are attempting to build an entirely new society from the ground up overnight.
They also deliver on their promise of peace, but at a staggering cost. In March 1918, Lenin forces through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. It is a humiliating treaty.
Russia surrenders massive amounts of territory, including vital agricultural and industrial lands in Ukraine and the Baltics. But Lenin argues it is the only way to save the core of the revolution.
But the internal political reality is rapidly shifting toward dictatorship. The Bolsheviks had allowed the long-promised elections for the Constituent Assembly to go ahead in November. But when the votes are counted, the Bolsheviks only win about 25%.
Who won the rest?
The peasant-focused socialist revolutionaries win the massive majority.
So what does Lenin do?
When the assembly meets in January 1918 and refuses to rubber stamp the Bolshevik decrees, Lenin simply sends in armed guards, locks the doors, and dissolves the first and only democratic parliament in Russian history.
Lenin's justification was that the Soviet system, which the Bolsheviks controlled, was a higher form of democracy than a bourgeois parliament. But the reality was naked power consolidation.
They began outlawing other political parties. They established the Cheka, the first iteration of the Soviet secret police, to hunt down counter-revolutionaries. The press is censored.
And this blatant power grab, combined with the humiliating peace treaty, ignites a horrific civil war. You have a society entirely brutalized by WWI, and now they turn those weapons on each other.
The Russian Civil War is a conflict of staggering complexity and brutality. You essentially have three main forces.
Yep.
You have the Reds, the Bolshevik army, brilliantly organized by Trotsky.
Then you have the whites.
Right. A loose, highly fractured coalition of Tsarists, conservatives, liberals, and anyone who opposed the Bolsheviks. The whites are funded and armed by foreign powers, Britain, France, the U.S., Japan, who are terrified of the communist contagion spreading.
And you have the Greens peasant armies who are fighting both the Reds and the whites, just trying to protect their local communes from being looted.
The violence is apocalyptic. Both the Reds and the whites use terror as a standard military tactic.
Let's look at the mechanisms of survival for the Bolsheviks during this time. They implement a policy known as war communism. The cities are starving because the economy has completely collapsed.
So the Bolshevik state literally sends armed detachments into the countryside. They hold peasants at gunpoint and requisition all their grain to feed the Red Army and the factory workers.
It creates immense hatred among the peasantry. But the white armies were often worse. When the whites recaptured territory, they often brought the old noble landlords back with them, taking the land away from the peasants and hanging anyone who resisted.
Ultimately, the peasants hated the Reds, but they feared the whites more. They chose the lesser two evils to keep their land.
The Bolsheviks also leveraged the massive ethnic diversity of the empire. They promised self-determination to the non-Russian nationalities. They work with Muslim jihadist reformers in Central Asia.
But the reality of this cooperation was often bloody and hypocritical. Historical accounts note that in places like Khiva in Central Asia, Bolshevik forces massacred local nationalists under the guise of defending socialism.
The ideology was rapidly becoming a justification for pure imperial control.
By 1920, the Red Army emerges victorious, but they inherit a graveyard. Millions are dead from war, disease, and a horrific famine caused by the requisitioning policies. The economy is producing a fraction of what it did in 1914.
So what does this all mean for the future of the Soviet state? Lenin dies in 1924, and the resulting power struggle is won by a man who turns the autocratic tendencies of the party into a totalitarian nightmare, Joseph Stalin.
Which brings us to the devastating mechanism of forced collectivization. By 1927, the Soviet cities are facing a massive grain crisis. The state is setting artificially low prices for grain to feed the industrial workers.
And the peasants, operating rationally, refuse to sell their grain at a loss. They either hoard it, feed it to their livestock, or sell it on the black market.
Stalin views this entirely through a paranoid ideological lens. He doesn't see a pricing mechanism failure. He sees capitalist sabotage. He blames the kulaks.
the kulaks. Originally, this term just meant a slightly wealthier peasant, maybe someone who owned a couple of cows or hired a farmhand. But under Stalin, the term is weaponized. Kulak becomes a label for any peasant who resists the state. It becomes a death sentence.
Stalin decides that the fragmented, independent peasant agriculture cannot sustain the massive industrialization he wants to force upon the country. His solution is collectivization.
Starting in 1929, the state essentially declares war on the Russian village. They send armed party cadres into the countryside. They confiscate the land, the tools, and the livestock from the individual peasants, and they force everyone to work on massive state-controlled farms called kolkhozs.
Think about the psychological violence of this. You are taking a peasantry whose entire cultural identity is tied to the land they literally just bled for a decade ago.
Yeah.
And you are ripping it away from them, turning them back into serfs for the state.
The resistance is fierce and tragic. The peasants realize they are going to lose their animals to the collective, so rather than hand them over to the state, they slaughter them.
Between 1929 and 1931, the Soviet Union loses a third of its cattle and half of its horses. They literally eat their capital.
The state responds with overwhelming terror. Millions of kulaks are arrested, thrown onto cattle trains, and deported to the freezing wastelands of Siberia to build the first camps of the Gulag system.
And the tragic irony is that collectivization was an absolute economic disaster. The disruption to the agricultural cycle, combined with bad weather, creates a man-made famine of unimaginable proportions between 1930 and 1933.
Over 4 million people starved to death, primarily in Ukraine and the grain-producing regions.
We have a primary source from this era that cuts through the massive statistics and hits you right in the chest. It's a letter written in 1933 by a young boy addressed to Mikhail Kalinin, a high-ranking Soviet official.
Oh, I remember this. It's brutal.
It is. The boy writes, "My family is large. There are 4 children. We don't have a father. He died, fighting for the workers' cause, and my mother is ailing. I want to study very much, but I cannot go to school. I had some old boots, but they are completely torn and no one can mend them. My mother is sick. We have no money and no bread, but I want to study very much."
It's just devastating. The father dies fighting for the workers' utopia, and his reward is his children starving in the dirt without boots. It is the ultimate failure of the promise.
The failures were so massive that quiet criticism began to murmur within the Communist Party itself. People questioned the chaotic, brutal nature of Stalin's planned economy.
And Stalin's response to this criticism was to launch the Great Purges. He argued that the failures weren't policy errors. They were the work of active saboteurs, spies, and counter-revolutionaries hidden everywhere within society.
This raises an important question about the cost of this forced development. It is a mechanism of total psychological terror. By 1939, the secret police, the NKVD, had arrested over 2 million people.
And these weren't just political rivals. They were engineers, teachers, military officers, loyal party members.
The process was horrific. People were arrested in the middle of the night. They were subjected to physical and psychological torture until they signed utterly fabricated confessions admitting to being fascist spies or Trotskyist saboteurs.
They were forced to implicate their friends and colleagues. Then they were either shot in the back of the head in the basement of the Lubyanka prison or sent to the Gulag labor camps where millions died of exposure and overwork.
The supposed workers' utopia had become a nightmare for millions. The state was consuming its own people to enforce a reality that simply didn't exist. It was a dystopia of the highest order.
But, and this is the massive, complex pivot of the 20th century, while the interior of the Soviet Union was a nightmare of terror and famine, the exterior branding, the global projection of the Soviet message was incredibly potent.
Which brings us to our final section, the global gaze. How did the rest of the world look at this blood-soaked experiment and actually find inspiration?
Right. To understand that, we have to look at the global context of the 1920s and 30s. A massive portion of the globe was subjected to brutal, extractive European imperialism.
The Bolsheviks realized very early on that if their revolution remained isolated in Russia, the capitalist powers would eventually crush it. They needed a global revolution, so they aggressively exported their ideology.
They founded the Comintern, the Communist International, an organization explicitly designed to fund, train, and direct communist uprisings worldwide.
They weren't just making speeches, they built infrastructure for global subversion. They established the Communist University of the Workers of the East in Moscow.
They actively recruited young, brilliant, angry intellectuals from the colonies, from China, Vietnam, India, brought them to Moscow, trained them in Marxist theory and guerrilla tactics, and sent them back to destabilize the empires.
And the message they were sending was profoundly attractive to a colonized mind. To a young intellectual in India, British capitalism didn't mean free markets and innovation. It meant racial subjugation, resource extraction, and the Amritsar massacre.
So, when the Soviet Union declared that capitalism and imperialism were the exact same enemy, and that the workers of the world must unite across racial and national lines, it sounded like salvation.
We see major Indian figures deeply fascinated by the Soviet experiment.
Yeah.
You have leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and the poet Rabindranath Tagore traveling to the USSR.
They come back and write extensively about it. You see titles appearing in Indian languages, Hindi, Bengali, Tamil like the Red Revolution and the Rebirth of Russia.
There is a primary source from 1920 written by an Indian traveling in Soviet Russia that perfectly encapsulates the emotional core of this appeal.
Right, I was just looking at that. He writes, "For the first time in our lives, we were seeing Europeans mixing freely with Asians. On seeing the Russians mingling freely with the rest of the people of the country, we were convinced that we had come to a land of real equality."
Analyze the mechanics of that observation. That writer has spent his entire life in a society rigidly segregated by race, where an Englishman walks on a different side of the street than an Indian.
He arrives in Moscow, and he sees a white Russian worker sitting at the same table eating the same bread as a worker from Central Asia or China.
It is an intoxicating, overwhelmingly powerful illusion of true human brotherhood. That image alone fueled anti-colonial movements across the global South for decades.
But it was an illusion, or at best, an equality forged by forcing everyone equally under the boot of a totalitarian state.
Exactly. And eventually, the truth bleeds out. By the 1950s, especially after Stalin's death and Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech acknowledging the horrors of the purges, the global illusion shatters.
The world recognized that while a backward country had become a great industrial power, it had done so by denying essential freedoms and relying on deeply repressive policies.
Even the most ardent international supporters had to reckon with the reality. They had to acknowledge that, yes, a backward agrarian empire had been violently dragged into the 20th century. It had defeated Nazi Germany. It was sending rockets into space. It eventually industrialized and fed its population.
But the cost was millions of dead peasants, a massive gulag system, the absolute suppression of free thought, and an atmosphere of pervasive terror. The developmental projects were built on top of mass graves.
By the end of the 20th century, the international reputation of the Soviet model of socialism was in ruins. The global left had painfully decoupled the ideals of socialism, worker protection, economic equality, from the specific brutal mechanisms of the Soviet state.
The ideas were rethought, fractured, and evolved in countless different directions. Which brings us to the end of this immense historical journey.
We covered a lot of ground today.
We really did. We started with the philosophical vacuum of post-revolutionary Europe, with conservatives, liberals, and radicals debating how to structure human society.
We watched as Karl Marx's critique of the factory floor grew into a massive ideological movement.
We shifted to the massive, frozen, archaic Russian Empire. We saw the pressure cooker of World War I shatter the autocracy, leading to the chaotic dual power of 1917.
We witnessed Lenin and Trotsky execute a surgical infrastructural coup, skipping the capitalist phase entirely in a massive ideological gamble.
And finally, we watched that utopian promise devolve into the horrific realities of civil war, forced collectivization, and Stalinist terror, even as it inspired anti-colonial movements across the globe.
It is a history that demonstrates the terrifying power of an idea when it is completely divorced from the constraints of human empathy. Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over.
What's that?
The Russian Revolution promised a shortcut to total human equality. But looking at the millions sent to labor camps, it begs a question that still haunts us today. When a government decides to force equality from the top down, at what point does the pursuit of the perfect society become the very thing that destroys our humanity?
Wow. A heavy but absolutely necessary question. And it brings us right back to our starting point, imagining a world where the fundamental rules of society are ripped up and thrown into the air.
As the history of the Russian Revolution shows us, when you throw those rules into the air, you cannot always control where they land.
And the impact can crush millions. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the historical narratives, keep digging for the mechanisms and the why behind the facts, and we will see you next time.